Okay, welcome everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the June edition of the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization's monthly event series, which we call Green Cities. I am tremendously excited to welcome my friend and mentor, Alan, and former colleague, Alan Mallach, to join us today for his for a talk on his new book, Smaller Cities in a Shrinking World, subtitled Learning to Thrive Without Growth. Publication date of 2 days ago. So this is a very exciting, hot off the press opportunity for us to dive into really what I found to be some remarkable takeaways from this book. And I'm excited that we're going to have the opportunity to share that here together and join in a conversation. I'd like to say just a word about the CSU, and then I'll introduce Alan and turn the floor over to him. The Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization is an organization that promotes the discourse and translating ideas to action in areas of design and sustainability and urbanization. We have a longstanding and very productive relationship with UN Habitat and enjoy the privilege of being able to bring diverse stakeholders to conversations at the UN and vice versa. Our Green City series is monthly. Most of our events are recorded and are available on our website or on YouTube, and this one will be as well as shortly as possible. I'd like to introduce Alan. As I said, my dear friend and mentor. Alan is a planner by profession, academic by night, I think, and has contributed greatly to the discourse on urbanization for in a great number of areas. Importantly, from drawing on his experience in Trenton as director, and in partnership with many local governments, many think tanks, many academic centers and academics, and local governments on the importance of and ways to get at how to revitalize legacy cities or distressed cities, or whatever you want to call them, if you read that section in his book. Alan is also the author of a book that I have found a great deal of takeaways from, The Divided City. And a little known fact about Alan is he also is quite an expert on Italian opera and has 2 books on opera. So if you are looking for a Renaissance person, you've found one. So again, welcome. This is being recorded and we'll post it online. Alan, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Well, thanks, Nick. And I'm delighted to be here to talk about Puccini and his role in the transformation of early 20th century opera. Now, seriously, I'm going to talk about smaller cities in a shrinking world. And first, I will share my screen and try to, hopefully this will work. There. Yeah. So I really want to start with talking about what does it mean to be a shrinking world, because this is something I think that people are just starting to rethink the whole issue of the world's demographic and population future. And it's very different from what an awful lot of people think. I mean, some of you, the older people in the audience, might have read, this goes back about 50 something years, a book that sold millions of copies called The Population Bomb. And it was about how the world was on a totally out of control growth trajectory. Millions of people will die of starvation immediately, and still hundreds of millions later. It was a powerful book. It prompted massive commitments from the United Nations, the United States, and lots of foundations to deal with population control. And of course, the most important thing about it, it was totally wrong. The population bomb never went off. Probably the best projection of future population growth, which comes from an organization called the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington, has this as its trajectory. We now have about not quite 8 billion people on the earth. That's going to continue to grow until the mid 2060s, probably peak somewhere short of 10 billion, and then start going down. By 2100, we'll be under 9 billion, and so forth. Now, this is not consistent across the world. It's true for most of the world, though. If we look at the population trajectories of the world, we find there are basically 5 patterns. There's first a whole huge chunk of South and Central Asia and Eastern Europe that is already losing population at a significant pace and will continue to do so. There are other parts of the global north, particularly the Anglophone countries of North America and Australia, as well as Western Europe, that are on a trajectory to decline, but that trajectory may be put off for some time, depending on how much immigration they take. In contrast to the other countries that are not taking any significant immigration. You have South Asia and Central and South America, where growth is slowing down at quite a rapid clip, and you'll see some countries going in decline by around 2050. One of them, which may surprise a lot of you, is India, which already has shrinking cities. The one remaining part of the world that it will have sustained growth beyond 2050 is Africa and the Middle East. And this part of the world will account, by 2050 and beyond, this will account for an increasing share of global growth. And it will continue to grow even as the rest of the world towards the end of our century is in decline. But as you can see, most of the world is either in decline, on the way to decline, or can see it through the rearview mirror. Now, this just very quickly, these are all countries that are either already losing population, like Poland, Bosnia, Portugal, Ukraine, Hungary, Japan, Georgia, and so forth, or are projected to lose population between now and 2050. So it's a lot of countries. I won't go into this in any detail, but this is a growing trend. With every decade, there will be more countries in negative growth. So just to illustrate this, you can see what's happening to fertility rates, which refer to the total number of births per woman during their childbearing years. In order for a population to remain stable, that rate has to be 2.1 or higher. Now, if we look at the OECD countries, today, the vast majority of them are either below that replacement rate or barely above. The only exception, for a variety of idiosyncratic reasons, the only affluent developed country in the world that has a fertility rate that is significantly above replacement and is not plummeting is Israel. Otherwise, every developed country is at or below replacement. And the United States is as well. Again, if 2.1 is replacement, the United States is currently at 1.65. And all of a sudden, in the last couple of years, analysts and pundits have discovered that the United States is actually on a potential trajectory towards negative population growth, and they don't like it. People are very worried, very afraid about losing population. It sort of goes against our national ethos. And obviously, people are trying to figure out what do we do about it. So there's a lot of talk. Should we provide free daycare? Should we provide more parental leave? Should we provide family allowances? Should we provide free bus passes to families with 3 or more children, et cetera, et cetera? The fact is, the research is very compelling that none of this is going to make more than a very insignificant difference. Once a country's birth rate goes down below replacement, it's likely to stay there. And so, more than anything else, I think the trends that I'm talking about here towards a smaller world, shrinking populations in more and more countries is essentially baked into our demographic nature and is not amenable to policy change. Now, obviously, the United States does accept immigration, but as everybody knows, that's a politically fraught topic. With immigration at current levels, the United States will probably go into negative growth in the 2040s. Without immigration, it will be a negative growth within the decade. Now, when you get this type of demographic shift, you get a fundamental change in the makeup of the population. And Japan's a pretty good example. Japan, this is a population pyramid, which shows the distribution of people. The bottom are the youngest, at the top are the oldest members of the population. And what you can see is that from 1950, when Japan was an overwhelmingly young society, to 1985, when it was fairly mixed, today Japan is becoming a society of the old. Almost 30% of Japan's population today is over 65. China is heading in the same direction. China went into negative population growth, or at least they acknowledged they were in negative population growth this past year. And because of a lot of factors, their downward trajectory, now that it's begun, is going to be very rapid. By 2050, as you can see, China will have a top-heavy, elderly-heavy population distribution. And this is going to have a huge impact on a lot of things about Chinese economy and society, because over the next 30 or so years, China will lose 100 million young adults and gain 150 million old people. So these are shifts, again, once you get into the population decline and the demographic change, the aging of the population follows inevitably. So these are baked in trends. Now, another factor which is going on is obviously people are not sitting still. People are constantly migrating. There's rural migration from rural areas, small cities, large cities. There's suburbanization, which is a form of migration. There's international migration. So all of these factors muddy the waters and change the population dynamics of countries. A lot of Western European countries would be losing population already if it were not for immigration. The United States, as I mentioned, will soon be in the same boat. But the overall, so there are a lot of different types of migration, but the overall dominant tendency is from periphery to center. So if we look at Japan as one example, the 4 prefectures, which are the equivalent of states in Japan, which have the largest net in migration. And bear in mind, only 7 out of 49 prefectures have net positive migration. The 4 largest are the 4 prefectures that make up the Tokyo metropolitan area. The next 3 are in the Osaka Kobe area and Fukuoka, which is the economic center of Kyushu, the South Island. The migration is concentrating Japan's population in those 7 clusters of population out of the 49 states. Okay, it'll come up. So I'll come back to migration, but one thing, there are two other factors that are critically important in trying to understand what's going to happen in the future. And I realize betting on the future is not a very sound proposition. I think somebody once said, and it was not Yogi Berra, by the way, prediction is difficult, especially when it's about the future. So I realize that, but I'm going to try to stick within stuff that seems to be fairly logical and fairly well baked in already. And one of those things is climate change. Now, I am moderately optimistic that we're starting to deal with these issues, so not to the extent they should be, but I think there's going to be a lot more impact over the next 30 years than over the past 30 years. And I would say certainly there's going to be more flooding. Large parts of the world, including much of the American West, will become increasingly desertified. And for most of the world, the climate impacts will reduce GDP. There may be some exceptions, Canada being one, Northern Europe being another. But overall, climate impacts will be overwhelmingly negative for the greater part of the world's population and the world's countries. Finally, at the same time as all this is happening, what was essentially the global order that provided the basis for the globalized economy that has dominated the world for the last 40 or so years is disintegrating, maybe a little strong, but unraveling is not. Between increased conflicts, trade wars, etc., supply chain problems, the whole globalization project, if you will, is starting to unravel. So all of these factors go in to have a huge impact. So if you think about it, we have slower population growth, aging, climate change, and conflict all lead to reduced productivity, consumption, environmental crises, and economic instability, all of which work negatively to affect growth. Now, I realize there are a couple of counterbalancing factors. There's been an awful lot written in the papers in the last, 6 months about how AI is going to increase productivity, regenerate growth, et cetera, et cetera. I am not convinced. But reduced economic growth also has a bunch of other key factors. It reduces capital investment. It increases the concentration of where the growth goes. It increases inequality, and it prompts those who have to engage in resource hoarding. All of this has a dramatic impact on cities. And it's the smaller peripheral cities that will feel the greatest impact because of the great sucking sound of what's happening as people move to the mega cities, the major regional and global centers. So you have brain drain, economic losses, loss of investment, and so forth. So this is the picture that we're looking at. Now, one example, this is what I call the globalization trap, is where small cities, Peoria being one of many, are basically trapped in a total dependence on the global system and an equally total inability to have any influence whatsoever on what happens with that global system and how it affects their city. So take Peoria. Peoria is a fairly prosperous small city in Illinois. Its urban economy is entirely dependent on a cluster of Caterpillar plants which market to the global market. If that market becomes less effective, less efficient, or if Caterpillar decides that it can market to the world more cost effectively from Mexico or anywhere else, they will go. Peoria has no say in the matter. Simultaneously, all of the rich, productive farmland that surrounds Peoria is devoted to producing corn and soybeans for the global market. Everything that people in Peoria consume comes into the city and the region from the global market. Any hiccup in that system will affect Peoria. And if my assessment of what's going on in the world is even moderately accurate, there are likely to be a lot of hiccups in the coming years. So what this means is that we're going to see a lot of cities that are losing population. A lot of cities that are going to find themselves in an increasingly difficult position. This, in Bulgaria, which is a country losing population, the only city in the country that is not losing population is the capital, which is also the center of business, finance, culture, and government. So this is a pattern we are going to see more and more of. And here is the key point. Shrinkage for a city is not just a number. It's not just a statistic. It has significant environmental effects, economic effects, demographic effects, and fiscal effects. And in and of themselves, they're all problematic. Some of them may be able to be turned to advantage, but they're all fundamentally problematic. I could spend a lot of time going through all of these, and I think it's really important, but I'll just let you look at these for a moment to get an idea. All of these are direct outcomes of population decline, aging, economic decline, fiscal stress, and the effects on the environment of a smaller population. And it's not pretty. Now, so the question is, if the world is losing population, and many, or will lose population, and many countries are already losing population, and thousands, literally, of cities in the world are shrinking, is this the inevitable end game for the world's smaller cities? And obviously, this is not a good outcome. And so the question is, are there alternatives to this outcome? And basically, I believe that there are, and I'd like to spend the rest of my time talking about what those alternatives might look like. This is an overall picture of a model. What I've called this networked localism. It's based on a number of key propositions. The first key proposition is, in a world of increasing economic, geopolitical, and environmental instability, small cities, which are not in a strong bargaining position to begin with, will be increasingly at the mercy of forces that are basically working against them, unless they take steps to diversify their local economies and increasingly localize those economies. The second proposition is that there are a whole series of things in terms of today's technology that we already have that can be used to make this not only far more workable than it might have been in the past, but also to enable a city, be it Peoria or a city in Lithuania or Japan, to localize its economy while remaining networked to the larger economy, the larger society, larger institutions. And in fact, it's that networking that makes it possible for a city to thrive even without growth. rather than becoming an isolated place where people are just taking in each other's washing. And there are four elements, four basic frameworks to this model. One is economic, one is environmental and quality of life, one is social, and one is, you might say, civic or political. And they add up, I believe, to a sustainable city. So let me talk a little bit about each of them. Okay, the environmental framework is key. Actually, this is where losing population can become potentially even an asset because of the opportunity to green the city. The opportunity, such as this small city not far from Milan did in Italy, to deal with stormwater overflow. They created a water park where the stormwater is basically channeled into a series of lakes, streams, basins, and so forth. You could urban agriculture or peri-urban agriculture, going back to Peoria. Nothing that the Peoria population eats, for all practical purposes, is grown locally. And yet, if you took just 2% of the land in Peoria County, which is currently devoted to corn and soybeans, and converted that into intensive fruit and vegetable production, you could generate enough fruits and vegetables to feed the entire population of Peoria on 2% of that land. So the first area is creating an environmental framework that greens the cities and does so not just in the interest of beautification, as important as that is, but does so in the interest of dealing with environmental problems like sewer overflows, dealing with food security, dealing with heat island issues, and a host of other problems associated with cities that can be addressed through greening. So the environmental framework is one part. And again, people are doing, as you can see from the pictures, lots of things in this area. And this is probably the one area that's furthest along in terms of the sustainable city model that I'm talking about. Second is, you could call it a social framework or a service framework. One of the things, as I was researching it, I was kind of amazed to realize that current technology means that if you're in a small city in, say, Kansas, and need some kind of emergency operation, as long as the local clinic has the right equipment, that operation could be performed by a surgeon sitting at her office in Chicago. I think we all know that hybrid learning, remote learning, and so forth has become a thing since the pandemic. And the beauty of these is that the use of technology means that people who live in a small city, a peripheral city, can have access to the same level of healthcare, the same level of educational opportunity as people living in the major metropolises. Another thing is the types of changes to make cities age-friendly. I'm particularly fond of both of these pictures. The upper picture shows a robot leading an exercise class in the Senior Citizen Center in Japan. The lower one is a wonderful experiment that's going on in a small city in Oklahoma, where the owner of a nursing home or assisted living home, I'm not sure, decided to co-locate a pre-K center with the cooperation of the school district inside the nursing home. And the amazing thing is that both the kids and the old folks benefit from it. And it has had dramatic impacts on the quality of life and the health levels of the residents. And the kids apparently enjoy it as much as their elders. So now some of this stuff is technologically driven, some of it less so. I don't know that we need to have robots leading exercise classes in our senior citizen centers or nursing homes, but it's one way of, again, making a community age friendly. And I should mention, by the way, with all these things I'm talking about, I discuss them in far greater detail and try to explain how they might work and how it could be done in my book. A third area is economic, and this becomes more complicated, but there are three areas. First is the concept of microgrids and distributed energy, and the ability for a city or a region to provide its own renewable power sources has grown amazingly over the last few years. The lower image on the left is a plant. It's a biomass power plant outside a small city in Lithuania called Šiauliai or something like that. It provides the heat for half of the city's population and 15% of its electricity needs. The other area, which is, I find, utterly mind-boggling, is the growth in these kind of what are known as distributed manufacturing systems. Most people are familiar with 3D printing, but it's gone way beyond that. These are what are known as CNC, or computer numerically controlled machines. And now these are relatively large ones, but you can buy one of these for $25,000, put it on a workbench, and basically make almost anything you can imagine as long as you can get the raw materials. And there are growing numbers of these systems being set up all over the world. The beauty of them is you can not only make things, but you have low capital investment, and you can basically tailor your production to the needs of the community. In other words, if you build a huge factory to make 1 million cars a year, you have to make 1 million cars a year. If you use one of these things, you may not be making cars, but you could be making furniture, you could be making office supplies, you could be making prosthetic hands or arms, you could be making lots of things, machine tools, parts for larger machinery, all in the numbers and that you need locally. And it becomes an effective way to rejigger your manufacturing, increase the extent to which the economy is and the products of that economy retain locally with a low capital investment. Another area, which I think we all know about, we're still not entirely sure how it's going to sort out in the end, is remote work. I believe that there are an awful lot of people who don't necessarily want to live in New York, Chicago, Tokyo, London, and so forth. And the beauty of all of these systems is they mean that people can live where they want to live, work where they want to work, and the two are not necessarily linked. And in fact, there are cities around the country. One example is Tulsa is offering people who will come and settle in Tulsa and work remotely $15,000 plus a year's free membership in a WeWork type facility, et cetera, et cetera. And over 1,000 people have taken them up on this offer. So all of these pieces come together. Finally, is you can't do this from the top down. You can't order people to change the way they operate. It has to be done through a process that brings people together. And what you need in cities are the sorts of places and the sorts of connections that enable people to come together to start figuring out how do we change our trajectory as cities. And again, there are a lot of different ways of doing this. The one thing that I think is an amazing institution, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is the passeggiata in Italy, where at a certain prearranged time, basically everybody comes into the heart of the city to walk around and say hello to each other. So I won't go into any detail on this, but I think one of the things that is absolutely critical, if you have a sustainable city, you have to have a city that is coherent and integrated in the sense that people are talking to each other, people are working together, and that the changes that you're trying to make are meaningful to the people of the city, not something that a few people cooked up in a back room or something that seemed to work well somewhere else. So to wrap up, just a few thoughts on the classic question: can we get there, or how can we get there? Clearly, if it's a question of dissatisfaction with existing conditions, I think we've got that. At the same time, to turn that into the will to change is difficult. And that requires a lot of fundamental changes to how we think about our communities and our relationship to them. Cities, small cities in the United States, have very little capacity even to continue on the largely unproductive paths that they're on, let alone to change more productively. They are fragmented racially, culturally, economically, socially, spatially, in all kinds of ways that make it difficult for them to build a consensus around anything. Many of them lack strong institutions, lack the kind of adaptive leadership that's capable of leading people towards new directions, and lack the skills that are needed to get there. Overcoming those barriers, building those institutions, and developing the will to change is difficult. I think it's possible. What we're seeing all over the world is cities. I can't say that there is any city or city region that has adopted what you might call the full package of networked localism. But there are lots and lots of cities, more and more, that are adopting specific features. So I mentioned this Šiauliai in Lithuania is becoming increasingly connected to renewable, locally generated energy. Tompkins County, which is where Ithaca, New York is located, is developing a local food system based on local farmers. Many examples. Cities like Detroit and others are using their vacant land for tree farms, agriculture, open spaces, and so forth. You can go on and on. There are a lot of programs. There are cities in Japan that have the most amazing network of services and support systems for their older populations. So people are doing the pieces. It's now, I think, a matter of starting to pull all of this together. So I believe that we don't have to see a future where our cities, especially our small peripheral cities, our shrinking cities, just simply decline to the point where they become the urban equivalent of failed states. I believe that there are paths towards success, paths towards thriving and sustainability. I don't want to minimize the challenge, but I think it's possible. And I think it's important to bring up all of these ideas so that people can realize what's possible and hopefully communicate them and try them. So I thank you.
Well, thank you, Alan. Thank you very much. I appreciate you putting this slide on the screen, reading reading my mind. I neglected to say at the beginning of the webinar that to purchase the book, if you use this code, you can get a discount. So that's a good deal. Also, among people who ask questions, one will be given a free copy of the book. In fact, you'll be given this copy of the book in my hands. So if you would like to be eligible to that, please put your question in the chat, in the Q&A rather. Alan, thank you. There's some remarkable takeaways from that. Some of the statistics that you shared are ones I had never seen before. And I think few have, and many of us have worked in and around these issues for a very long time. Thank you for the hard work you put into producing this book and the discussions you've had to get it there. As we pivot to some of the questions, I will kind of read off the first one here. It's from one of my former students, John Ferre. He asks, will climate change and the lack of water in the Southwest US spur migration back to the declining cities of the Rust Belt, which have now unused infrastructure to build upon and support the population affected cities can no longer handle?
I doubt it. First, I think there will be some climate migration. I think when the temperature in the daytime in Phoenix reaches a point where simply getting from your air-conditioned car into your air-conditioned office puts you at risk of heat stroke, I think people are going to start thinking twice about continuing to live there. Though, of course, those of you who read the New York Times realize that Phoenix is trying to come up with a deal where they're going to get desalinated water from the Sea of Cortez, pump it 300 miles over the mountains, and then drink it, presumably. But I think that's somewhat unlikely, but you never know. But when that migration happens, I think the problem is that the Rust Belt cities are so radically different and really unequipped for significant migration, whether it's politically, culturally, historically, and so forth. And if you're a climate migrant from Phoenix, you have a whole host of closer opportunities, which are warm, admittedly, but not as hot. Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Raleigh, Atlanta, and so forth, which are closer to the environment you're trying to leave without being threatening because of excess heat. So I really doubt very much that you're going to see significant migration into Rust Belt cities like Detroit or Duluth from the Phoenixes and the Las Vegases, even at the point where you start seeing climate migration.
Thank you, Alan. We have a number of questions rolling in and comments about solutions or the path forward. I'd like to ask you a little bit about a topic you and I have discussed and debated for many years, which is the tension between sort of utopian visions, incremental visions, or perhaps aspirational or pragmatic visions. There's a spectrum there. Can you speak, you highlight also the theory of change and the importance of a really clear theory of change in order to implement really anything at all, but the visions outlined in this book in particular. Can you speak a little bit to the theory of change and its importance and kind of the types of visions or approach to really thorny problems, right? These are those intractable challenges.
Yeah, I think it is basically, I am an incrementalist. I believe, and I can argue this point strenuously if need be, that essentially all or virtually all positive changes in human society have arisen through incremental change, not through radical shifts. And I think there's a trap if we get caught up in stuff that's too radical, too utopian, and we fall flat on our face. That works against any kind of meaningful change. So I think change has to be incremental, change has to be grounded. At the same time, if we do things on too small a scale, we never get untracked. I mean, it is wonderful. I mean, the Talmud, I think it says somewhere that he who saves a single life, it's as if he saves the whole world. And I like that sentiment. It's a wonderful sentiment in terms of how individuals should live their lives. But if you devote a great deal of time, energy, and effort, and so forth, to a program that helps one person, and there are 1 million people who need that help, you're not actually changing the environment and creating an environment that will be more sustainable and thriving. So you have to find, it has to be incremental, but it has to be big. But I think the small city and its surrounding region, which typically we're talking about a city that could be anything from 30 to a couple of 100,000 people, and a surrounding county or 2 or 3, is a size and an environment in which you can have meaningful incremental change and that is a realistic option. But the other thing about theory of change, I think this is a fancy word for basically you have to know where you're trying to go before you start going there. If you don't have a clear idea of where you're trying to go and don't have a clear logic that says, I'm trying to do A, B, and C, and they will lead to where I want to go for the following reasons. If you can't articulate that and be convincing about it, at least then you may never get there. You may spend a lot of time and effort, never get there.
Thank you. We have a number of questions coming in around politics and a fragmented polity, as you characterize it in the book. Clearly, this is an important topic that many people from many fields and professions have been addressing, or at least trying to, particularly in the last several years. Can you speak a little bit about both that and somebody else clearly has read other of your writing, because we have a couple questions here on state preemption and the tension between local cities that are trying to do the right thing and more conservative or status quo state legislatures that are preventing them from doing such things. How do you see, or do you see, a way out of that dynamic? Can you speak to that a little bit?
I think, it's interesting. When I think about the types of things I'm talking about and whether they're likely to materialize, I find myself a little more optimistic about some countries in Europe and about Japan, oddly enough, than about much of the United States. Because I think the extent to which we've created a series of intense conflicts between the whole red state, blue city thing is a huge example of that. But the conflicts around race, gender, the whole way in which we look at our world has become a matter of intense conflict and strain. And that goes against any type of coherent, productive, incremental change, because by definition, that requires building a consensus around the direction of change. And I think it's going to be a real struggle. I think the preemption issue has become just a huge battle in states like Texas, Missouri, Tennessee, where essentially cities that are trying to do things that make sense to them, and looking at it from the outside seem to make sense to me most of the time, are being told by state legislatures, sorry, you can't do that. Totally arbitrarily. And now, from a legal standpoint, obviously the state calls the shots. But from the standpoint of trying to build productive cities and build a productive society, we have huge parts of our polity who are basically digging their heels in around, we do not want anything to change, while they're facing a world where change is going to happen, because there's nothing that Governor Abbott can do about population change, about globalization, about climate change, and so forth. And ultimately, change is just going to hit these people over the head. And I think from a political standpoint, I think large parts of this country are just so deeply mired in denial that I don't know how we're going to get out of it. That doesn't mean people shouldn't try, whether it's in Flint or Peoria or Austin or wherever, but it's worrisome.
Indeed, it is. Alan, let me ask a different question, or different type of question, maybe building on that, which is maybe some more, maybe some implementable steps. So there's some lessons learned specifically from Riga or specifically from Japan that are that we should take note of in the United States context.
Well, I think, for example, now we have a rapidly aging population. It's nowhere near what Japan's is, but it's growing on a rapid basis. And Japan has really developed systems to work with the elderly. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to use that term anymore, but as one of them, I feel I'm kind of allowed to. But so, for example, in my book, I profile a small, not at all significant city of about 100,000 population, about 2 hours west of Tokyo, called Kiryu. Kiryu has a network of 8 senior centers that both are places for gathering and for activities, but also where the staff coordinates the services for the senior citizens in their sub-district of the city, whether it's in terms of need for different housing issues, health issues, caregivers, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a coordinated service system. You have a program like, I think a lot of old people no longer should be driving. In Kiryu, if you come and voluntarily relinquish your driver's license, they will give you a free bus pass for a year, plus a coupon book for discounted tickets in local taxis. On top of that, and this is important because, older people are still in many cases productive and energetic. And this is a national program in Japan. They call it the Silver Centers. And you pay a small annual fee to be a member. I think it's the equivalent of $20 or $25. And that gives you access to umpteen referrals for short-term or part-time jobs. It could be anything from stuffing envelopes to doing something more sophisticated, whatever. And they all pay, not lavishly, but they all pay something. And the idea is you're helping out, the local employers and so forth, and you're being active and doing it in a way that fits your schedule, your needs, your wants. So the idea is to have a complete system like this. And now the Riga project is a wonderful project. It's a bit of a fluke. So I don't know that Riga as such can teach us, but I think it's a classic example. In a middle of Riga, an old sports center was demolished maybe 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. And the site, 5-acre site, and sat empty. Meanwhile, a developer bought it, wasn't doing anything. come the pandemic, and this is kind of an interesting bit of cross-fertilization. A young Latvian student who'd been studying in the United States went home to be with her family during the pandemic, lived nearby, saw this, said, we can create something beautiful here. Organized the community, got the city's support, convinced the developer to give them a 3 or 4 year lease on the property, and turned it into an amazing combination of individual allotment gardens and community open space and gathering and picnicking and what have you space. Sadly, the site will probably eventually be developed, but the beauty of it, it says it's not only what it does environmentally, but this was a bottom-up initiative. This wasn't started by the city government or the national government or by a foundation. It was started up by people who lived in the neighborhood, who then went out and convinced the government and the owners to go along with it.
Thank you. I'm going to try to squeeze a couple of the last questions into one, or I'll just throw them out and you can answer the parts you want. Anne Englot asks if you can discuss how your model interacts with those areas of the world that are experiencing sudden mass migration due to extreme political, social, climate changes or conditions. In the other direction, an anonymous attendee asks, isn't it actually great for nature and climate change to reduce some of these cities? Can't we just move people from struggling and dying cities to other areas and reduce our human footprint? And finally, well, we'll just end with those two.
Okay, well, first on the moving people, this is something that comes up periodically, but people like to make those choices for themselves, basically. Now, there are examples in post-war Romania, when the communist government was trying to industrialize in the cities and they needed an urban workforce. They literally sent troops to villages and said, congratulations, you're all going to come live in such and such a city, and they were required to move. I don't think we want to go that route. I think people have loyalties to their communities. Now, there are certainly plenty of cities in the United States and elsewhere that have lost their economic function that they came into being for. And certainly people who want to leave do leave, but a lot of people don't. And as long as we have a social safety net and we provide things like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and SNAP, et cetera, people will continue to be in, and we're talking about places like Flint, Michigan, or Johnstown, PA, or Youngstown, Ohio, so forth. People will continue to live in these cities. And I think we have to recognize that. And I think when we start thinking about a serious urban policy in this country, which I hope we will someday, probably not in my lifetime, that we should start thinking about how can we ensure that people in places like Youngstown and Saginaw and Johnstown have a decent quality of life and opportunity, whether they want to stay there or leave. As
maybe we are out of time, Ellen. So I think Anne's question is a great one, and the subject
is a great one. It's a tough one.
A lot more conversations to have. Yeah. And I think it would be great if we could have a Green Cities talk on just this topic. The Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization actually had a flagship convening at the United Nations a few years ago on exactly this topic, but it's a different world and we know a lot more. So I'd encourage us to continue this conversation.
Migration is the big, it's sort of like the elephant in the whole global policy world.
So, Alan, I want to thank you again for your time. I want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank all of the attendees and participants, those who asked questions and made comments, and spent an hour today with us exploring this. I would encourage you all to pick up a copy of the Smaller Cities in a Shrinking World book if you don't already. And the discount code is on the CSU's website, which is csu.global, and is available there. Alan, did you want to say a final word before
Yeah,
we say
I just
goodbye?
wanted one thing, and this is blatantly self-serving, but I do because I am eager to see this book and the ideas get out. If you thought this was worthwhile, and there's an organization or university or somewhere where you'd like to have me speak and present this, I would be very happy to talk to you about it.
You've already got one in the chat, so we'll keep that going. Keep that going. Send Alan an email, send me an email, or message. If you don't know how to get a hold of us, message us on the CSU's website. All of those channels will work. Thank you very much for your time and your wonderful questions today, everyone. And thank you, Alan, again. Have a good afternoon,
Nick.
everyone.
It was a pleasure.